Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
This is January 26th, 2021, and this is episode 159 of Transmission.
159. All right.
Yeah. Yep, and I'm Mark Van Stoenik. I direct the Center for Prophetic Imagination.
And I'm Daniel Wolpert. I direct MICA, the Minnesota Institute of Contemplation and Healing. And as is so often the case, sometimes our topics come from suggestions or comments that all of our great listeners and commenters make. And so yesterday there was, at one point we got onto marriage. So we were talking about gay marriage in churches.
Splitting and stuff. Yeah.
Splitting and all of this. And, so there was an interesting comment about the function of marriage, and talking about sort of purifying or making holy within the context of marriage, the actions that outside of marriage were not holy, i.e. having sex. Everybody's favorite topic. And so, we thought that was kind of interesting, and thought it might be fun to talk about this issue of purity and impurity, because that really does lie behind actually many of the things that we're dealing with in society right now. We're talking about, a pandemic, right? We're talking about germs and infection and this issue of what's going on with whiteness in our society. And, all of these are purity kinds of issues. So, I thought we'd just jump into that.
We often don't really talk in terms of purity and impurity, like overtly. So it's always lying.
Not overtly, yeah.
I mean, sometimes, like purity culture, we can talk about true love waits and sex before marriage and being pure. It comes up there. People on the left will talk about purity politics, where people are being overly doctrinaire about things. But in general discourse, we don't recognize the role of purity and impurity. It seems antiquated. No. Like when we read through the Gospels and see about the clean and unclean stuff, it's confusing to us because we don't think we have a similar system.
Right.
And we don't recognize that we do.
But for those who are old folks, you may remember a very famous commercial, the Ivory soap commercial. And this was, I don't think I was in elementary school. Maybe I was in high school. But, I was a kid. And so, this commercial came on and said that Ivory soap was 99 and 44/100% pure. That was the end tagline of the commercial. And, they didn't say pure what. they didn't talk about it, but it was clear that just saying that, was appealing. Like that sounded good to people. Now, it turned out that the backstory to the commercial is kind of funny, because when the company actually did their basic analysis of the soap that they had to do for, I don't know, themselves or the FDA, I don't really know. It turned out that, whenever you assay anything, you always lose a little bit. And so when they added up all the components after they did their assessment, it came out to 99 and 44/100%. So in other words, the test lost half a hundredth of a percent of matter. So it turned out that Ivory soap is 99 and 44/100% pure matter. Which, basically means nothing.
Well, and they have variations of this, like so pure it floats. I remember that.
Right.
And then they recently, this ties in. I think it was recently that they got in trouble for having ad campaigns saying white is pure, and because their soap bars are white, and so if you do a search for purity, it has lots of. If you look at Google Images, you can see lots of clear water and lots of snowy whiteness. So there is this idea of whiteness and purity, which has been built into our system. And then it's worth looking at. Here's a comment already, just to throw this up, just to kind of help frame things even more. Ellen writes, I read in a Spiritual Direction magazine, lots of people have a narrative from this purity idea that whatever big trauma in their lives contaminated them. So addressing the purity issue can help with narratives seemingly unrelated, i.e. car accidents, etc.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So this idea of purity is very, very old, and in many ways, there is a kind of an evolutionary reason for it, right? That as human beings were developing, and you're trying to figure out like what to eat, and where to poop, and you're having sex and all this different stuff, and what you find is that sometimes you do things, and and you get sick and you die, right? And so what begins to develop in every society are all these rules about how you do these things, right? Essentially to try to keep from getting sick. And so, at that level, there is something that makes sense about it, right? And obviously, we've all been washing our hands a lot during the pandemic, and you want your surgeons to wash their hands before they operate on you. That's a good idea. But then, of course, what starts to happen is that these physical notions start to migrate into all kinds of other notions, right? Notions of religion, whether or not God likes you, are you pure? Are you impure? What does physical illness say about your spiritual condition? What are things that you can do to make God dislike you? And then in America, of course, this then gets imprinted on race. And so, so the white race is pure, and you want to keep the bloodlines pure. And anything else is some sort of impurity, which is bad, either bad to God or the social order or whatever it might be. And so it is fascinating how we take this concern, and a lot of purity issues are based on fear, right? So you got people who are germaphobes, and they're sort of terrified of catching something and getting sick, and so you take this fear of some kind of bad thing happening if you mix stuff, and and you then project that into all kinds of other social realms, and it becomes really problematic.
Now, and it's interesting. A lot of this is, we don't recognize the way that a lot of this is socially conditioned. And I've brought this up before, but the Lassana Harris, Susan Fisk stuff on infrahumanization, like when they show these images to people, and it's whether or not their medial prefrontal cortex lit up and recognized the face, had to do whether or not if their disgust mechanism was triggered. And so they'd show pictures of like toilets and stuff in this kind of mix, and then they'd show pictures of like someone who looked dirty and homeless looking, and they found that the disgust that comes up renders you unable to see their humanity. Now, but this isn't instinctive, not at core level. Like, so right now, if we saw a bunch of insects crawling around, we would probably be grossed out. But other cultures see insects and like, that's a food source. That's not gross at all. So a lot of this stuff, it's really conditioned. Like, we might have some universal, like human disgust things, like we don't usually eat our own poop. That might be baked in like at a more primal level. But a lot of our disgust, ideas of purity, impurity, gross, not gross, is socially conditioned, and it operates outside the level of choice. So like once you're conditioned this way, you don't decide, oh, black person, gross. You have this, you could be the most well-meaning person in the world, who sees a black person and have a triggered response of, oh,
Yeah.
danger, gross.
Yeah. Well, and and it's interesting, like even the poop thing, right? I mean, you think about babies. I mean, babies don't have any problem, wallowing around in poop.
Just hanging
I
out,
mean,
rubbing it everywhere. Yeah.
yeah. I mean, and but parents very, very quickly intervene in a very intense way to teach babies not to do that. And again, there's a good reason for that, right? I mean, if you're human, you eat your own poop, you're going to get sick. But yeah, there really are very few innate purity kinds of concepts and reactions. Which is, as I said, why this develops, because you can die if you do certain things, and then that gets translated into this concept.
Yeah,
We got a couple more comments here.
Ellen writes, I also remember purity being a part of an evangelism spiel. Would you give a baby a bottle with just one drop of deadly poison in it? Sin contaminates you and you need to be purified by Jesus. I mean, that's another big piece. Is like, I used to evangelize that way. I used poop and ice cream as an analogy. I still use it as a metaphor. Like, don't poop in someone's ice cream as a way of like harshing their mellow. So it's still in there, but there's this idea that evangelicals do that is also something that Jesus accused other people of during his time, is conflating sin and uncleanness, which are not the same exact categories, although they overlap. And so even evangelicalism kind of totally tightens that comparison. And so Jesus confronted this idea of cleanness versus uncleanness to the point, and it's worth pointing out to bring in some Jesus, that under the rules of his time, like by him touching someone who's unclean, he rendered himself unclean. And but that's how he healed. He brought cleanness to someone by becoming unclean himself. And so there's all sorts of fascinating things to think about when we look at how we work within that logic today. And it almost always has to do with sex. Like the ew factor when it comes to gay sex is such a driving piece of this. Since different kinds of taboos are all about are all us having our purity response kind of gamed to maintain a hegemony. And Lisa also points out disability. This totally works within the realm of prejudice against disabled peoples. Kathleen writes, women were examined for proof of purity, not men. That's still right. That still happens.
Yeah, and then that's a very interesting particular segue, right? Because, of course, the reason for that is that it's property issues, right? So you want to be sure that you know who the baby belongs to, and you want to make sure you know who the woman belongs to, right? And so the idea of purity then gets overlaid as sort of the justification, right, for these kinds of examinations. But really, it's this property method of social control. Right? And so, but you convince people that it's a purity issue, and so that becomes the rationale. And then what's fascinating in the pandemic, right, is we kind of have this reversal of this, right? So now you've got all these people who are like, well, I don't want to wear masks because I don't want to be afraid of this thing, and God's got me covered with the pandemic. Right. And so you have people wanting to claim that they don't want to feel bad or don't want to feel afraid that they might be impure or they might get this disease. And a lot of that then has gotten turned into this political stance, right? Because if I'm afraid, then the government is controlling me, right, and making me do what it wants me to do, put on this evil mask, which is muzzling me somehow in my humanhood. And so that's a place where the purity thing is very active, but it's active in this kind of like paradoxical backwards way.
I think it's competing purities. Because the question is like, well, this disease is bad, but it's mysterious. But the contagion that is the state is not a mystery to me, and I don't want to be tainted. Like there's some of that logic. Like you don't want to you don't want to collaborate even a little bit with this because the government is evil. So there's that sort of logic. So I think there might even be competing
purities, right? This is a fake purity to keep me away from the real purity issue.
For sure. Yeah. Stefan writes, when empathy is studied, it is also shown that if we consider someone ugly, we will have less empathy for them.
Yeah. Yeah, and so there really are all these internal kinds of divisions of mind in a way, right? Where we're constantly setting up these boundaries of who's in and who's out, and and our social milieu, right? Our family, our tribe, our country, teaches us to attach those divides to this purity discuss thing so that we, almost physically recoil. Right. And the whole business of, Central American migrants, right, being dirty, being rapists, bringing diseases, being unclean in all these ways. I mean, if you look at all the rhetoric around that, it's all meant to trigger this purity disgust kind of mechanism.
Yeah, you can usually see a purity logic employed, whether it's named as such, whenever human beings are referred to as animals or barbaric. These are language. Civilized, uncivilized has to do with pure and impure a lot of times. So, and even evangelical, and not just evangelical culture, a lot of people have this way of seeing things that you don't even want to engage in other religious systems unless you're strong in your faith. Otherwise, you will be tainted and contaminated by those ideas. So there even gets this idea of like you don't even question authority or even raise questions about what you believe unless you're somehow a super Christian. So the way I saw this work out in my rural evangelical context was we had some folks that we knew that would go to bars to evangelize. But I shouldn't evangelize because I'm not strong enough in my faith because there's too much temptation at bars. Which is true because now I've become totally a karaoke junkie because I've been given over to that disgustingness.
Yeah, and right. So purity of thought then is a whole other way that this gets deployed, right? And definitely see that within the fundamentalist Christian world, right? And this is actually one of the arguments about why spiritual practice and contemplation is not good, because that will open your mind to Satan. And if you're not just repeating dogma and doctrine and Bible verses over and over and over again, but you're actually, opening your mind to listen for the Spirit, what you're actually going to listen to is Satan.
Demons.
And then you're screwed. Right.
Those demons just wait around for you to be silently listening without thoughts in your head, and then they're just going to pounce in there.
The demons are waiting.
Gus writes, if folks are interested in a fantastic book on Jesus breaking purity rules, check out a book, Unclean by Richard Beck. I and other friends interviewed him in his old in a Iconocast. Interestingly enough, Richard Beck sang karaoke with me once. So he's not just a good scholar. He's also doesn't mean Sweet Child of Mine by Guns N' Roses. Gus also writes, I mentioned how Jesus cleans by touching. Unclean doesn't overwhelm clean in this logic. My favorite example is a swimming pool filled with wine. I think it's probably supposed to be urine. I'm on the opposite side of the pool, pouring a tiny vial of urine. You would take a glass from your side. Most people say no.
Yeah, clean. And then he corrects that. Clean doesn't overwhelm dirty.
So the idea is, and this is again, Jesus. It's important to think about how Jesus thinks about purity and impurity, clean and unclean himself, when we think about terms like blessed are the pure in heart. Because when Jesus engages with people that are rendered unclean, his whole point is that compassion brings cleanness and purity. That you shouldn't bracket yourself off from people you determine unclean, but you should lean into them with compassion, which is not at all. The last sermon I spoke at Amy, my wife, grew up in this conservative Baptist church, and they, for a long time, would let me come preach a couple times a year, even after I was an evangelical. And the last sermon I gave was about cleanness. And I told them that you shouldn't defend yourself against like Muslims, gay people, blah, blah, blah. But if you're really following the way of Jesus, you need to reach out and touch them without expecting anything from them and see what happens. And they did not like that at all. And surprisingly enough, that was the last sermon I ever preached at that church.
Yeah. Yeah. And so then when you Faith, I grew up in that church.
Yep. Basswood Baptist, great church. Yeah. There's some good people there, but this is endemic to like how a lot of Christians, not just evangelicals, think about their faith is Christianity is a pure thing that needs to be guarded against impurity, which is the opposite of Jesus's logic.
Yeah, and so then if we look at what is happening in the GOP right now, where they're thrashing around and kind of melting down, right? There's all this activity around this purity test, which is basically, do you support Trump no matter what or not? And so in Arizona yesterday, or Monday, the GOP, the party there, censured all these Republicans, saying that they were, liberal and globalists and not supporting Trump. And there's this big, brouhaha that's going on, that's going to continue for a while, right? And Trump's threatening to start a new pure party. And the only platform of the party is supporting him for president. Like, it doesn't have anything else, right? Even the fact that the GOP this year, they didn't endorse a party platform, right? Their only platform was love Trump. And so again, that purity piece just keeps coming back as a way of, can we just parse things out better and better and better, so that we somehow arrive at this great unwashed state, and I think that's part of the thing that we need to kind of interrogate here, right? Is this, myth of, because it all derives out of the way the story of Adam and Eve is interpreted, right? That there's some pure state that we used to be in, and it was great. And look, I mean, we were running around naked eating vegetables. So that's, that is kind of great in some ways. And if only we could get back to that, right, by doing, X, Y, and Z, or by not doing X, Y, and Z, then everything would be fine. And again, this is a particular reading and interpretation of that story, which I think in many ways is highly problematic and in fact wrong, because when Adam and Eve were naked and running around eating vegetables, they also didn't even know that they were human. And so really the story of the garden is a story of becoming human, which comes along with this problem of personal awareness, which is also a gift. And so if we see ourselves as moving towards something that is better, rather than trying to go back by just figuring out what to do and not do, I think we arrive at a much healthier vision of what our spiritual and social and political life is supposed to be about.
Just a comment from Ellen. It's a fairly complex question. Is class analysis a new purity metric? Do you see Jesus joining with the least of these as instructions for us to become lesser in order to heal in this context? I'm thinking of the downward mobility of privileged hipsters who are hoping to lower the privilege average to lift up the least privileged. I mean, purity in class is a very interesting, phenomenon, because the way it traditionally works is upper class is pure, lower class is impure. And we even see this like around the world when caste systems tend to have this sort of way of thinking about purity. But then within this example you gave of middle class hipsters or upper middle class hipsters, like condescending to be with low, to me, that doesn't necessarily fundamentally challenge the nation of pure and impure. Instead, it becomes this sort of poverty porn. To me, the solidarity of trying to combat this system itself is good. And then within leftist circles, we get into whole sorts of arguments we call purity politics over how whether or not we should be tainted with reformist measures. So like purity is going on all over the place in there.
Yes, exactly.
And so the issue isn't like, it's good to have analysis. I don't think we should always be compromising, but we need to reflect on how this sort of instinct towards like, fuck them, they're gross, and I'm going to cut them off from my compassion. Like, we need to recognize where that shows up.
Yeah, as you said, the purity instinct is going on everywhere, and I mean, we just see this all the time. I mean, we see this, in health, and I mean, Deborah and I see this in the integrative medicine world all the time. It's like, the endless search for the perfect diet, the perfect set of supplements, the perfect set of habits and practices. So I'm going to be perfectly healthy somehow. And, it gets to a point where it doesn't even mean anything, right? And you have this whole phenomenon of the worried well, people who are, again, on average across the world, perfectly healthy, but are continuing to search for this, pure state. So yeah, I mean, it really is a thing that we as humans do that I think is very, very helpful to be aware of.
Kathleen writes, I will never forget Trump questioning Megyn Kelly's purity, blood coming out everywhere.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I mean, modern as we are, right? The fact that women have periods and bleed is still this thing that is very deeply embedded in our social psyche as being an impure, problematic thing. And it's just, it's kind of amazing how these notions stick around and keep showing up.
And like just to look at the way it plays out in the left. So the right wing, you can see how that happens with kind of shaming of certain behaviors and people as being lesser thans. On the left, we see this with respectability politics as a type of purity, tone policing. This idea that having anything other than calm, reasoned discussion is somehow, anything other than that is impure. So if you bring anger into it, anger, like in that, the idea that anger is impure is like, you see that within certain Buddhist groups. You see it within certain Christian groups, like somehow that anger renders something impure, which is foolish because it's a very deeply human emotion that often is reasonable.
Yeah. And, the fact that, I mean, Scotland has just agreed to provide every woman in Scotland with feminine hygiene products, irrespective of their ability to pay, essentially part of like our sort of SNAP type program. I mean, the fact that is this sort of big deal and this revolutionary idea and kind of, makes the news. And I think it's just another example of this. It's like, well, it's like Medicare for all. I mean, of course, people should be able to have those basic things they need to take care of themselves. Like, this shouldn't be a big deal, but it is.
Stefan writes, Malatesta's text, Class Struggle or Class Hatred, talks against falling into considering poor people as pure because they're not upper class exploiters. I mean, this is, you see this too, like there's kind of this naive sort of liberationist thinking that somehow, and I saw this, like, so for 15 years ish, we did this intentional community in the Catholic Worker Mold where we'd have guests. And so many people had bought into this idea that Jesus is present among the least of these in a way that thinks in purity concepts. And so when a homeless person experiencing homelessness was vomiting on themselves and being an ass, like all of a sudden it was like, what do I do? I don't see Jesus in that at all. And so this sort of like this weird idealized that somehow if you show someone love, they'll be, thank you. And no one's ever cared for me. And then they cry tears and all of a sudden they're middle class all of a sudden. Like that's kind of baked into a lot of people's understanding of this sort of fetishizing of the lower castes within our society. And that doesn't help anything. There's a tendency towards that among anarchists, Marxists, and other leftists that is naive and unhelpful, for sure.
Yeah. All right. Well, we've gone through another episode and are actually kind of finishing close to on time. So this is a very pure episode.
Very clean.
Very clean.
Pristine.
So, all right. Great to talk to y'all. See you tomorrow.
See y'all tomorrow.